With 6 days to go till the general election, the party leaders fight it out over who will do a deal with whom. Ed Miliband again says no coalition and no deal with the SNP.
I made clear last night that I'm not going to have a Labour government based on a deal or a coalition with the Scottish National Party.
And if Ed Miliband is really saying he would rather have a Tory government than work with the SNP for more progressive politics, then it's final proof that Labour has lost the plot.
Meanwhile, David Cameron says an EU referendum is a must for any deal with the Conservatives, although he'd rather govern alone.
I think it's perfectly fair in the next 6 days to say, look, I've done coalition. We made it work. We've got a good record. I've got the T-shirt, but I don't want to do that again. I think Britain would do better now with a strong, decisive and frankly more accountable government.
We'll be asking whether the deals that might be struck after the election have become any clearer. Good evening. The election campaign stepped up a gear today with the party leaders crisscrossing the country as a debate raged over who would do a deal with whom to form the next government. David Cameron said the prospect of a Labour government propped up by the SNP was as real as ever, despite Ed Miliband again ruling out such agreement today. The SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, said that Labour had lost the plot and that voters would be appalled. Our correspondent Lucy Manning reports.
An early start after a long, hard night before. Ed Miliband heading to England, Wales and Scotland. That last leg where this election could hang.
Hi, morning, good to see you.
On the train to Cardiff, but Scottish issues dominating. His words last night that he'd rather not be in government than do a deal with the SNP.
The SNP and Nicola Sturgeon says it sounds like you want to work with a Tory government rather than work with the SNP, do you?
Not at all. I made clear last night that I'm not going to have a Labour government based on a deal or a coalition with the Scottish National Party. How people vote in Parliament will be a matter for them, but I wanted to be absolutely clear about this. You know, I've got no truck with the SNP as a political party. They want to break up the country.
But at the end of this election tunnel, if there is a hung parliament, some of his MPs said today the two parties could talk to each other about passing legislation. On the bus to Bristol, he was pressed. Would he talk to them in any way behind the scenes?
About changing our legislation? No.
Ed Miliband seemed to concede last night that there could be a minority government. He thinks he's dealt with all the issues about whether there could be a deal or make that no deal with the SNP. But questions remain.
Nice high five. You do fist bumps as well.
In Dundee, the SNP leader said Scottish voters would be appalled.
If Ed Miliband is really saying he would rather have a Tory government than work with the SNP for more progressive politics, then it's final proof that Labour has lost the plot. It will be the final nail in the coffin of Scottish Labour, and I suspect Labour in other parts of the UK. And do you know what? It makes it all the more important that we have a big team of SNP MPs, because we will need them to protect Scotland from the Tories, because clearly Ed Miliband's not prepared to do it.
And after the hard time he got last night, Mr Miliband knows he can't afford to slip up in the last week of this campaign.
I think most people are more interested not in me walking off the stage, but David Cameron walking away with their child benefit.
Flying into Scotland tonight, he has to fight for votes here, while reassuring those who still think deals might be done here. Lucy Manning, BBC News, Glasgow.
Well, our correspondent James Cook is in Glasgow for us. And James, what sort of reception is Ed Miliband likely to get when he arrives?
Well, he has just arrived in the past couple of minutes. He was whisked past a group of protesters by the police, and in the back door of this venue, "Red Tories out," they were chanting. And that underlines really the problem that Mr Miliband is facing, because here in Scotland his opponents are trying to characterise him as preferring a Tory government to doing any kind of deal with the SNP. Indeed, that is almost what he said last night. But on the other hand, if he does agree to negotiating with the SNP, Mr Miliband feels that he'll lose votes in Middle England, particularly if, as he would see it, he compromises on, say, bringing down the deficit and increasing public spending and not renewing the Trident nuclear weapons system. It is very difficult now to see how Ed Miliband can square that circle and win both in England and Scotland at this election.
OK, James, many thanks. Well, while Labour has been seemingly ruling out a deal with the SNP, David Cameron said a coalition with another party would depend on them accepting a referendum on Britain's EU membership, something the Liberal Democrats are currently opposed to. Mr Cameron also faced questions today about the party's plans for child benefit, as our correspondent Gavin Hewitt reports.
David Cameron's bus headed across the Pennines, confident in his performance in last night's debate, but aware the voters seem unforgiving with evasive answers. His first stop, the headquarters of Asda. In these final days, Labour is determined to make Tory plans for child benefits an election issue, saying they've refused to rule out cutting child benefits. Last night it was clear the subject of child benefits remains hugely important. Can you be precise? What are you ruling in and what are you ruling out?
We've said that we had to freeze it in this Parliament. We said we're going to have to freeze it for the start of the new Parliament, but child benefit stays because it's so important.
But the Tories insist they will not reduce or cut child benefit. Their problem is that they're still under pressure to explain where they'll find £12 billion in welfare cuts.
So the scale of this bridge.
The Chancellor and David Cameron met at a road construction site near Lancaster. With less than a week to go, the major parties are beginning to set out their negotiating positions post the election if they need to form a coalition, including what some of their red lines might be. For David Cameron, one red line is an EU referendum. Dropping that would be a deal breaker, and the Tory leader insists he doesn't want a coalition.
But I think it's perfectly fair in the next 6 days to say, look, I've done coalition. We made it work. We've got a good record. I've got the T-shirt, but I don't want to do that again. I think Britain would do better now with a strong, decisive and frankly more accountable government.
Later, asked whether a tie-up with UKIP was a possibility, the Tory leader said he didn't believe they would have any MPs. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Lancashire.
Nick Clegg has insisted the Liberal Democrats will not go into coalition with a larger party without clear commitments on future funding for the NHS. The Deputy Prime Minister said ensuring a new government met an £8 billion a year target for the NHS by 2020 was for him a political red line. Meanwhile, the UKIP leader Nigel Farage has said he could see his party lending support to a second Conservative Lib Dem coalition on issues to do with the budget and motions of confidence. But Mr Farage said it would only happen if there was a clear commitment to a referendum on the EU. Well, our political correspondent Ben Wright is at Westminster for us. And Ben, lots of laying out of positions here. Are we any nearer knowing who would do a deal with whom?
Well, Rita, we know some tie-ups have been ruled out. UKIP won't work with Labour. Nick Clegg won't work with the SNP. But it's like there are two parallel campaigns going on. Ed Miliband and David Cameron charging around the country, insisting they're going to win outright, and one of them might. The other campaign dominated by talk of red lines and deals. That's because all the polls at the moment are pointing to a hung parliament. Now, as we've been hearing, Ed Miliband said he will not do a deal with the SNP to get to Downing Street. But that does not stop the SNP backing a Labour Queen's speech in the Commons. And next week, David Cameron may well find himself looking for friends and allies too, the Liberal Democrats, the DUP, for instance. Because if no party gets an overall majority, it becomes a battle to find support in the Commons. It's the maths there that matters. And this time next week, we will know how the seats stack up and who might be heading to number 10.
Ben, thank you very much. Ben Wright there. Back to the election now, and one of the most memorable aspects of last night's question time was the audience. The tough questioning and the no-nonsense approach of the people of Yorkshire meant the party leaders really had to think on their feet in Leeds, as our special correspondent Richard Bilton found out when he went to meet some of those invited along last night.
That's looking really good, isn't it?
After helping shake up the election campaign, Catherine Shuttleworth was today back running her marketing company.
Morning. I saw you on the telly last night. Did you enjoy
She
it?
did sign the letter from small businesses supporting Conservatives, but she says she's not a Tory and doesn't know who she'll vote for. Last night, she took Ed Miliband to
That wasn't the
task.
question I asked you. I asked you why on earth I should trust a Chancellor. If he worked in the corporate world, he would have been fired and he would not be allowed back to do that job. And you're telling me he can do it.
Well, let me tell you, I can tell you, Ed Balls takes incredibly seriously the need to get the deficit down.
The audience were the people that asked the questions. They were the people that held them to account last night, and that's been the first time in this campaign for a lot of people.
Why should we trust you not to do the same thing if you can't even accept that you overspent?
It was a feisty audience, with all three leaders given a rough time.
Refusing to give specifics, and I found that very, very difficult. Let me answer that. Very difficult to understand.
Your promise on student loans has destroyed your reputation. Why would we ever believe anything else you say?
What was striking about the debate here at Leeds Town Hall was the level of frustration in the audience. There was a real sense that even after 5 weeks of campaigning, here was a group of people who still hadn't got the kind of detailed answers they wanted.
It felt really good that the people should be able to ask questions.
Linda Green was part of the onslaught. She says she'll vote Labour, and last night she tackled David Cameron.
Where there are 1 million using food banks, where people have been hit by really punitive benefit sanctions. That is not a country I want to hand on to my child.
First of all, let me say, I don't want anyone to have to rely on a food bank in our country.
And the main political party leaders are so worried about saying the wrong thing, making a gaffe, that what we're not having is a really interesting debate where people are raising real issues, you know, things that happen in people's everyday lives.
Good night. Less than a week to go, but many voters clearly still wanting more from the politicians. Richard Milton, BBC News, Leeds.
Tonight on Reporting Scotland, deal or no deal? With 5 days to go till the election, the focus in the campaign turns to what alliances might be formed after May the 7th. And I'll be speaking live to the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, in the last of our interviews with the party leaders. Deal or no deal? That's the question that's dominated the election campaign today, with the polls suggesting that no party will get a majority. The question of alliances or coalitions been raised. Last night, Labour leader Ed Miliband ruled out a deal with the SNP even more forcefully than before. Our political editor Brian Taylor is in the Borders for us tonight. Brian, how do we take that statement by Ed Miliband?
Well, it's certainly added an intriguing element, a further intriguing element to this quite remarkable election campaign. I'm in the Borders, and indeed at Abbotsford, the home of Sir Walter Scott, the great poet and novelist. Will be reflecting later on south of Scotland politics, some big contests going on down here. But first, the story of the day, the story from the campaign on the day. And as you say, it's all about political manoeuvring. Here's my colleague, Tim Reid.
So you'd rather lose office, so to speak, you'd rather not have a Labour government.
If the price of having
an apparent hardening in Ed Miliband's stance last night on the possibility of working with the SNP. Fast forward 24 hours and en route to Glasgow to rally support, a sign of just how important Scotland could be to his fortunes amid opinion polls which suggest a possible wipeout that could stop him from becoming Prime Minister.
No deals, no coalitions. I will put forward a Labour Queen speech before the House of Commons. And I want to be very, very clear with people. The differences are too big between us for us to be working together with the SNP in a deal. They stand for separation, for breaking up the country.
Back on the campaign trail too, Nicola Sturgeon on a tour of key constituencies which the SNP hope to take from Labour.
If Ed Miliband is really saying he would rather have a Tory government than work with the SNP for more progressive politics, then it's final proof that Labour has lost the plot. It will be the final nail in the coffin of Scottish Labour, and I suspect Labour in other parts of the UK. And do you know what? It makes it all the more important that we have a big team of SNP MPs.
Could this Borders town turn blue next week? The Tories certainly hope so. For weeks they've warned of the dangers of a Labour-SNP alliance in government and say only they can guarantee no deals with the Nationalists.
Ed Miliband's taken one look at the polls and given up on Scotland and left Jim Murphy in a bit of a fix, because at the start of this campaign he said he wouldn't rule out a coalition, then he ruled a coalition out but not a deal, then he seemed to rule out some sort of confidence supply, and he's all over the place. We've said right from the outset, on a point of principle, we believe that you shouldn't do a deal to put into government or in control of government a party that wants to break up the United Kingdom.
If you buy your ingredients seasonal.
But into the political mix, the probability that no one party will win enough seats to gain overall control. More hope then for the Greens.
I think Britain and Scotland need more Green voices representing us at Westminster as well as the other levels of government. So we're going to use the final days of the campaign to carry on putting that message across to as many voters as we can.
That's it.
A man's best friend, but it's the potential bond between all the parties which is becoming the key issue in this campaign.
I think no one party is going to have an overall majority at the next election, so we face a choice. You can either have the influence of Nigel Farage or Alex Salmond or the Liberal Democrats holding politics in the centre ground, keeping the economy on track and doing it fairly.
Yes, we know how you feel. It's not been a walk in the park for anyone over the past few weeks, and none of the parties want to roll over now. Tim Reid reporting Scotland.
Well, that's Tim Reid reporting there. We'll be covering Ed Miliband's speech. He's speaking in Glasgow right now. What he's likely to say is arguing that the SNP are a gamble. He says don't gamble with the SNP. A guarantee of social justice, a guarantee of a change of government, he says, comes with Labour. But Nicola Sturgeon is saying tonight that her party ticks all boxes. She says that they offer the prospectus on social justice. They offer strong voice for Scotland at Westminster, and they're the ones who would lock out the Tories. Two offers among the many being placed before the people of Scotland in this election campaign.
Brian Taylor, thank you very much. We're going to have now the last in our series of leader interviews. In a moment, I'll be speaking to SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon. But first, let's take a look at her campaign so far. Nicola Sturgeon leads the SNP with the party in buoyant mood. Despite the disappointment of losing last year's independence referendum, the Nationalists find themselves consistently ahead in a variety of polls, with one even suggesting the party could win every seat in Scotland. With a hugely increased membership and apparent momentum in the election campaign, the SNP has been the focus of attacks by rivals both north and south of the border. Depending on the outcome of the election, the SNP could hold the balance of power at Westminster. Ms Sturgeon says the SNP would not help the Tories gain power, but would be willing to work with Labour.
A vote for this SNP manifesto on May the 7th will make Scotland's voice heard at Westminster more strongly than it has ever been before. And a stronger voice for Scotland will mean a stronger voice for new, better and more progressive politics at Westminster for everyone.
The SNP leader has faced repeated pressure to rule out a second referendum during the campaign, insisting instead that the election isn't about independence. The SNP's main theme is ending economic austerity. They want the Smith Commission plan implemented fully, which would devolve to Holyrood control of income tax plus a share of welfare. They also want to go further and take full fiscal responsibility, and to see employment policy devolve too. The party's manifesto includes its opposition to upgrading the Trident nuclear deterrent and favours spending increases on the NHS in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And Nicola Sturgeon joins me now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Ed Miliband's made it clear, abundantly clear now, that he'd rather not be in government than work with the SNP. So if he attempts to form a minority government and won't talk to you, will you vote with him anyway? You've got a lot in common. Or would you be prepared to bring down a Labour government?
Well, what we would do is seek to exercise the influence that Scotland had given us in the House of Commons to win progressive change on policies like an end to austerity and protection for public services. Because the thing about being a minority government, and I understand this because I've been in a minority government, is that if you don't win a majority on polling day, then for everything you want to take through the Parliament, you have to get support from other parties. Now, that would put the SNP, if we had a substantial presence in the House of Commons, into a very strong position, because if you're a minority government, then you have to win support from others. If you don't do it as part of a coalition or as part of another formal deal, you have to do it on every single issue on a case-by-case basis. That's how you did it at Holyrood, and that's how it worked at Holyrood. But if Labour does what it says it'll do, if it says, look, just go ahead, vote any way you like, we're not talking, what would you do then? Well, they won't get their policies through, but the government doesn't get brought down. Why will they not get their policies through? Does that mean that you would vote against them? Well, if we didn't agree with them, yes, we would. So you might bring down a Labour government? Well, but the Fixed Term Parliaments Act actually makes the House of Commons now quite like Holyrood in this respect, because it is possible to change the mind
change the view, change the direction of a government. It's possible to beat and defeat a government on specific policy issues.
Would you vote against a minority Labour government on a confidence motion then, or a budget, and then pass the initiative to David Cameron?
You know, but we don't need to get into the realms of confidence motions. This is about trying to effect change positively and constructively. So what we would do would be to seek to persuade a minority government to change its budget so that we don't have more cuts.
But if he doesn't talk to you, if Ed Miliband actually sticks to his word and does not discuss with you, where's your leverage?
Well, if we then vote against a budget because it is looking to impose cuts that we don't agree with, then he doesn't get the budget through. The government doesn't fall. The SNP minority government, if you recall, in 2009, we failed to get a budget through the Scottish Parliament. We had to go away, we had to reconsider that budget, and we had to compromise and bring it back, and then we did get the support to get it through. So, you know, I know Ed Miliband wants to cling to the pretence that he's going to win a majority. The polls say he's not. And if he ends up in the position of being in a minority government, then he simply cannot continue to say he's not going to talk to anybody, because that means his own government will be paralysed, and he will not want that to happen.
But it would only be paralysed if you were refusing to vote with the Labour government.
But refusing to vote for things we thought were wrong. Now, I mean, let's talk about some of the things that he cites as differences between us. We want an end to spending cuts. We want modest spending increases so that we can invest in the National Health Service, in infrastructure and in tackling child poverty. Now, I thought once upon a time Labour also believed in these things, but he said no, he wants to have further spending cuts. So we will vote for things we agree with. We agree with Labour.
Yeah. But the fact is that if he doesn't talk to you, you lose your leverage, you lose your influence.
No, we don't, because he's the one that has to win a majority on every policy to get it through the House of Commons. And if he's not prepared to talk and to compromise, then he won't get things through. And you know, that would be a very strange position for any Prime Minister to be in.
You wouldn't be prepared to bring down a Labour government then?
Well, I'm not going into this, and the SNP's not going into this seeking to bring down governments or block budgets.
But it might come to that.
Well, we're actually going into to try to effect positive and constructive and progressive change. And the point is, you know, if there is a minority government, then the minority government has to reflect the reality of how people vote. Ed Miliband, I think, rather than say what he appeared to say last night, is that actually he'd rather watch David Cameron go back into Downing Street than work with the SNP. Surely what he should be saying is, well, respect how people vote. And if people choose not to give a party a majority, then the voters are saying they want parties to work together. And if voters in Scotland vote SNP, then they're saying they want the SNP to have a voice. Ed Miliband should respect that.
Let me ask you about second referendum. Before the referendum, you said that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. No qualifications, no saying it would depend how things worked or how it felt in your gut. You were very clear. Now you're refusing to rule out.
Let me say this. What I'm saying is, if people in Scotland want the referendum to be once in a lifetime, in fact, if they want it to be once in 10 lifetimes, that's what will happen. There can't be another referendum without the express permission of the Scottish people. Now, all the SNP could do...
What would have to change to make you propose a second referendum in your manifesto for the 2016
I'm not going to
sit
here and give a list for the simple reason I can't see into the future, but one of the examples I've used is if there was an in-out European referendum and if Scotland voted to stay in the European Union but the UK voted to come out.
The Conservatives aren't even proposing to have that till 2017. You've got to write this manifesto next year.
And then people will decide whether to vote for it or not. This is the fundamental...
But before we even get to that point, what are the conditions...
Sally, maybe nothing will change before we get to that.
Might?
But the point,
what's the sort of... I mean, just give us an idea.
I can't see into the future. I've given you one example. If the Tories are elected, as I hope they are not next week, and there's that prospect. But
I'm saying to you that's not going to happen till after you've got to write the manifesto.
In that case, that won't be something that changes in time for that manifesto.
So what might?
Look, I'm not going to give you a list of speculative things that I can't see into the future and predict. But what I am saying...
But surely we ought to have an idea of the sort of thing... I mean, would it be a major economic change? Would it be austerity conditions continuing under Labour, for instance?
There is a fundamental democratic principle here. If I was to propose, and it is an if I was to propose a second referendum in the next Scottish Parliament manifesto, or the one after that, or the one after that, it can only happen if people vote for it. And people will see the manifesto for the 2016 election before they're asked to vote in the 2016 election, and they can make a judgment. That the fundamental principle is that it's not me who decides whether there's another referendum, it's the people of Scotland.
But it's you that decides whether it goes into the manifesto.
But that's the same with all policies. Politicians propose and the voters decide. Now, I don't understand why any Democrat would have a problem with that, because that's democracy in action.
Well, here's what I think the problem is. All the indications are that beyond the very politically committed, most people in Scotland, however they voted in the referendum, have had enough of constitutional debate for now, and they would like you to get on with running the government here and not putting a lot of thought into
Sally,
a second
it's
referendum.
It's not me in this campaign that's talking about a second referendum.
Well, your candidates are.
Well, no, I've been explicit in this campaign. This campaign's nothing to do with independence. It's nothing to do with a referendum. I said, and this is not a prediction, but even if the SNP was to win every seat in Scotland next week, that is not a mandate for another referendum. This election is about making Scotland's voice heard more loudly at Westminster and then using that voice for more progressive politics.
But forgive me, you have got candidates who are saying that all that's needed is a load of MPs at Westminster.
That's not the position of the SNP. All of our candidates are standing on the manifesto that your film there showed me publishing a couple of weeks ago. This election is about making Scotland's voice heard. That's why I say, and I know people who voted no in the referendum will vote, some people will vote for the SNP next week, because whether you voted yes or no, even if you've never voted SNP before, this is actually a moment where Scotland can come together and vote to make our voice heard in Westminster more loudly than it's ever been heard before.
If you win, just say, 59 seats...
I don't think we will, incidentally, win every seat in Scotland.
Even rather a lot of them. Is that healthy for democracy in the long run?
If that's how people vote, you know, one-party states are where you don't get the option to vote for other parties. Scotland's got a democratic choice next week. There's a variety of parties Scotland has to choose from, and we should respect how people vote. We live in a democracy, and I don't think we'll win every seat in Scotland, and I take no vote and no seat for granted. I'll be campaigning hard. The SNP will be campaigning hard for every vote, because the more seats we do win, the louder our voice will be in Westminster as a country.
OK. Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's go back to the election now. Last night, Ed Miliband ruled out a formal deal with the SNP after the election, and the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, said people would be appalled by Mr Miliband's refusal to consider a deal with her party. Well, this evening, the Labour leader is in Glasgow to give a speech in the East End, and our political correspondent, Tim Reid, is there. Tim, I don't think he's started yet, has he? What's he expected to say?
No, he hasn't started, and he arrived earlier going through a back door to avoid some of those protesters, anti-Labour protesters who've gathered outside the door here today. They got here before even some of the invited audience. And Ed Miliband's pitch here today is because this is one of the Glasgow seats that certainly he has to try to hang on to if they're to have any chance of keeping the Labour majority they have in Scotland at the moment, and of course if he's to have any chance of having a majority at Westminster. And his pitch tonight will be to try to evoke the memories of Labour of old. Keir Hardie, the founding father, will get a mention. He will try to persuade people that if Scotland is to have the change that he says it needs, that they will vote Labour and not, he says, forget about the chance of doing what he thinks that they should be hoping to do. But of course they are swimming against a nationalist tide. He knows that. The opinion polls suggest that, and his hope will be that he can appeal to those undecided voters, in particular those third of what the opinion polls say are going to vote for the SNP and who have not quite yet made up their minds as whether they will do that. He will try to persuade Scots that the only chance to get a change at Westminster is to vote Labour. And one little bit of hope for Labour tonight, the Lord Ashcroft polls, which have said that there's going to be a sea of yellow across Scotland. One little bit of hope for Jim Murphy, who it's said was possibly going to lose his seat to the SNP. He seems to have pulled back the tide in his constituency, the one he's standing for, and I think Ed Miliband will be hoping that that will continue across the rest of the country.
Tim Reid, thank you very much. As we saw in last night's debate, the possibility of coalitions and deals is a hot topic in this election, and that's because there's very little expectation that one party will have a majority of seats in the House of Commons. Either Conservative or Labour is likely to need support, and that makes smaller parties far more important than they've ever been before, including, of course, the SNP. So whether it's Ed Miliband or David Cameron, how do you form a government when you don't have enough votes? Here's Douglas Fraser to explain.
Well, the rules for forming governments in Britain aren't about law so much as history and precedent.
60 years ago, loyalties were either Conservative or Labour. That year, Scotland was majority Tory, and there were no nationalist MPs and only 6 Liberal ones across Britain. Nearly all the time from then up to the last election, one or other of the big parties would have most of the seats in the House of Commons. That majority meant they could form a government. Down the years, these leaders stayed in power between elections so long as they kept their own side from rebelling. But then David Cameron had to do a deal with Nick Clegg to get enough votes for a majority. That means that of 650 constituency seats in the Commons, he needed more than half, at least 326. 5 years ago, the Tories had 306, Lib Dems 57 together. They were comfortably over the line. This election, again, looks like requiring either of the 2 main party leaders to seek support in this 7-party system, plus a handful more from Northern Ireland. Perhaps a coalition, an agreed programme with ministers from 2 or more parties, as we've seen in the past 5 years. Perhaps a looser arrangement, simply to ensure a minority government party gets the vital votes through, such as the budget. Or seeking to win Commons votes one at a time using shifting alliances. So, how might this work in practice next week? If no one party has a majority, David Cameron stays in office and has the first chance to find enough support from others. That's even if he has less than Labour. If he fails to find enough support, he has to resign, and the Queen asks Ed Miliband to form a government. That's when Nicola Sturgeon hopes her party's MPs will be decisive. Though the Labour leader said last night he's not doing any deals with her, even if it means he doesn't become Prime Minister. Nick Clegg's Lib Dems could also have the numbers to put Ed Miliband into office. It may even be necessary for 3 parties to form an alliance. We've been here before. Gordon Brown 5 years ago, and 41 years ago, Tory leader Ted Heath. Neither Prime Minister got the numbers he needed, so the leader of the opposition was asked to form a government. We have to go back 91 years to find a time when 2 much smaller parties combined to keep a much bigger one out. That Labour government, led by Ramsay MacDonald, was voted in by Liberals, but it didn't last long. We have to touch down in Edinburgh 8 years ago to see another option, which could hold a lesson for Westminster. Well, Alex Salmond didn't have enough MSPs to get to the threshold of half the seats in the Scottish Parliament. He had 1 more seat than Labour's Jack McConnell. The SNP leader was voted First Minister by a very tight margin, only because Conservatives and Lib Dems back then opted not to vote. The SNP minority government stayed in power for 4 years with shifting alliances across different issues by avoiding policies that could unite their opponents against them, or votes that could be seen as a test of the government's authority. The shape of post-election party haggling is established as a big theme of this campaign. And while the SNP and Lib Dems see this as making them key players, both David Cameron and Ed Miliband appear to be preparing the ground today for that option of a minority government. The winner will be the leader who's got not just history, but arithmetic on his side.
Douglas Fraser. Over the last week, we've been hearing from candidates and constituencies across Scotland about the issues that matter in their area. Today, we're in Aberdeen, where the current issues in the North Sea oil industry are top of the agenda. Stephen Duff reports.
Aberdeen Harbour, day and night, boats come and go supplying oil and gas platforms in the North Sea. The mouth of the harbour, the boundary between the Westminster constituencies of Aberdeen North and Aberdeen South. Since 1997, both have been held comfortably by Labour, but the SNP have high hopes of capturing the seats in next Thursday's election. The elegant Marine Operations Centre controls the comings and goings from the harbour. It's here we've gathered the candidates from the main parties standing in Aberdeen North. The future of oil and gas high on their agenda.
We can't get away from the fact of the importance of oil and gas to the North East. Should future governments give even more tax breaks to the industry? Richard Baker.
What has to happen is that certainly to have continued support for the industry, we campaigned for tax changes to support the industry, and Labour said they want to have ongoing dialogue with the industry over future tax changes to make sure that the tax regime is always right for the industry. But also need to do more to support business here in Aberdeen. That's why we're campaigning for a £3 billion city deal for Aberdeen to make it better, easier to do business here.
But no more tax breaks for the industry?
You know, potentially yes, because what's got to be done is by having a sensible discussion discussion regularly between government and the industry. That's not happened enough in the past. That has to happen in the future, and that's why we did campaign for tax changes to support this industry at this crucial time when the oil prices dropped.
What, Kirsty Blackman, should the Scottish Government and UK Government be doing better together for the oil and gas industry?
The Scottish Government and the UK Government should be working together. The Scottish Government acted really quickly when there was an issue with oil prices. The UK Government dragged its heels. That means people in Aberdeen have lost jobs as a result of this. The UK Government have not been upfront about the changes to tax. They've just imposed these tax changes, tax hikes and tax drops recently. They've imposed them without talking to the industry. What we need to do is we need to make sure that the UK Government and the Scottish Government have a really good dialogue with the industry and have stability for the future for the oil industry.
Ewan Davidson, you imposed tax changes without talking to the industry. Kirsty Blackman's right there.
What we've done through the Wood Review is set up the Oil and Gas Authority, so that's going to give us a forum to talk to the industry, to discuss future tax rises or tax changes. The reason the tax was raised in the first place is because we've reduced fuel duty on ordinary drivers, providing stability when oil and gas prices rise and drop, rather than Labour's fuel escalator, which was hitting ordinary motorists and constantly increasing the price. Now we've delivered the first tax cut ever for the oil industry. Under Labour and previous Conservative administrations, the tax had continually risen.
Okay, Sanjoy Sen, of course it was the damage that George Osborne did in his 2011 budget that caused the problems for the oil and gas industry, wasn't it?
Well, I'm somebody who's actually worked in oil and gas as an engineer for some 15, 20 years, so I know how cyclical that industry is. The way it tends to work is when oil prices are high, things are absolutely booming, companies make enormous taxes, and it's only right that they should pay their fair share towards health and welfare and education and so on. But this is a responsive government, and as soon as the oil prices crashed, we've responded to that. There's a huge 1.3 billion tax stimulus, and that's going to see the North Sea kicking back into life.
It was too long. You took too long to make the changes in relation to this.
The Scottish Government is very slow in responding as well.
The response has to be appropriate because Conservative responses are always costed. You talk about tax credits, you talk about a Norwegian-style system, but everything we do has to be costed. It's not about big breaks for big industry. It's not about giving tax back to multinationals.
Okay, Richard Baker, you said that the Scottish Government had been slow to act. What were they meant to do?
What were they
meant to do? It's all about taxation, it's all about costs.
No, it's not just about that. It's about supporting industry in terms of training, in terms of dealing with business at the moment. I mean, we called for a summit immediately. We had these problems. Nicola Sturgeon didn't visit Aberdeen for weeks until after that summit. So we responded very quickly. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government did drag its heels, and I think Aberdeen's paying the price for that as well.
What could you have done better than
the Scottish Government acted really quickly, and the Scottish Government acted to ensure that people receive training and people receive help to get into other jobs, and that ability to find new jobs in the oil industry. Folk on the doors are saying that the UK Government is the reason that job cuts happened so quickly, and there were so many of them. They think that if the UK Government had acted faster, then it would have been better for their jobs.
You're shaking your heads, Ewan Davidson?
Well, the Scottish Government refused to include Westminster agencies in their task force. So saying that they protected employment is nonsense. They refused to include the DWP and Job Centre Plus because it didn't make them look as politically good. They excluded the Westminster agencies, damaging what could have been a very progressive force for helping jobs in Aberdeen.
Okay, well that's happened. Sanjoy, what about the future? Where do you see the North Sea in 40 years' time?
Well, the North Sea's a long way from being over. My personal story is I moved to Aberdeen in the year 2000. And I always remember that because back in the 1980s at school in England, we were told the North Sea would be over by the year 2000. So it's anything but over. But production has peaked, the easy oil has gone. What we're going to need is a much more, if you like, technology-focused, intelligent industry where we develop technology, where we sponsor the new developments, which are then going to tackle the harder-to-get fields. That's going to need a lot more government and industry cooperation. Okay, finally, to Richard Baker, are you going to be the first Labour politician to lose Aberdeen North since 1935?
No, I think it's absolutely wrong to prejudge what the decision will be of people in Aberdeen North. We're fighting for every vote. We know we're in the fight of our life for the seat. We're having the biggest general election campaign we've ever fought in Aberdeen North as well, so we're responding. What people in Aberdeen need isn't more constitutional uncertainty. That would be very damaging for our economy, but they do need a change of government and protection for our local public services. That's not happened from Westminster, it's not happened from the Scottish Government either, and that's why Labour is the right choice still for people in Aberdeen North.
Okay, Kirsty Blackman, if you are one of a big group of SNP MPs at Westminster, how's your voice going to be heard?
We're going to make clear that we always put Scotland first. We will always put the people of Aberdeen. If I go to Westminster, if I'm down there, I will make sure that Aberdeen North is my #1 concern, and that is what I will be doing. I will be speaking to people. I'll be making sure that I represent the views of people in this area.
Well, thank you all very much. There are two other candidates standing in Aberdeen North, Tyrone Rutherford for the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, and Christopher Willett for the National Front. Well, if you think Aberdeen North is interesting, across the water, Aberdeen South is equally as intriguing. Another battle, it would seem, between the SNP and Labour. So will Aberdeen, Scotland's third city, Europe's energy capital, send its first ever nationalist MP to Westminster? Well, we'll all find out together next Friday morning.
And there are 6 candidates standing in Aberdeen North. You can see a full list on the BBC Scotland news website. Now let's return to our political editor, Brian Taylor, who's still in the glorious surroundings of Abbotsford House with the beady eyes of Walter Scott upon you there.
The glorious surroundings indeed, Abbotsford House in the south of Scotland near Melrose. We'll be talking south of Scotland politics very soon, but let's be frank about this. I am a huge admirer of Sir Walter Scott, so indulge me for a few seconds while Giles Ingram of the Abbotsford Trust gave me a quick look round.
This is the great man's study. Sir Walter Scott used to sit in this very armchair here. This was his desk, in which he wrote with a quill pen many of his finest works.
What was the phrase, with this right hand I will make it good, or something like that? When he was paying off his debts, he said he would just keep going.
He did, he had enormous debts to pay off, and he sat here with his timepiece to check that he was writing enough words per minute, per hour, to pay off his debts. So now coming into the Chinese drawing room, so named because of its beautiful hand
wallpaper, yeah.
Printed wallpaper, absolutely. And as you walk straight to the centrepiece,
Rayburn, presumably, yes.
Absolutely, fantastic, famous portrait of Sir Walter Scott in his prime.
His loyal dogs with him at all times.
Absolutely, he was a fantastic dog lover, and you'll see so many paintings of him with his dogs.
Yeah. Presumably, Giles, this is the dining room.
This is, yes, absolutely, and famous, well, infamous, I suppose, as being the room within which Sir Walter Scott spent his last hours.
He was brought, wasn't he, to look out on the Tweed? Is that
he was, yeah. He came back to the house. He was very unwell. Yeah. He couldn't make the stairs to his bedroom.
So he brought the bed down here.
That's right.
And his family around him.
Family gathered around him and were there as he passed away.
Sir Walter Scott's house here at Abbotsford. But of course, we're here in the south of Scotland to talk politics. 3 seats, 3 constituencies across the whole of the south of Scotland. Big contests in every one of them. My colleague Willie Johnston reports.
The River Sark at Gretna marks the Scotland-England border. Beside it, Auld Acquaintance, a stone cairn built ahead of last year's referendum to symbolise UK unity. Last September, the South voted by 2-1 against independence. On the face of it then, this is stony ground for the nationalists. And yet, a mere 8 months on, the polls are now suggesting that the SNP are in prime position to challenge Labour, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems respectively in the 3 seats which span the south of Scotland. They stretch more than 200 miles from coast to coast, take in sturdy country towns, picturesque villages, former mining communities and lots of hills and farmland. Trade for prime stock at Dumfries Auction Mart is mixed today. Farming's fortunes depend on market forces out with its control, largely driven by the supermarkets where most of these cattle will end up. The inability to set its own prices is one of agriculture's biggest weaknesses, but not its only frustration.
Bureaucracy that's in the job. That is a major priority that needs reduced, but as I say, there just seems to be more rules with everything that we do, and that seems to be continuous year in, year out. The politicians continue to say that we'll make less of the job, less red tape, but it never seems to happen.
Parts of the south are undoubtedly well heeled, but wealth is not evenly spread. This is a low-wage economy with weekly pay more than 3% below the Scottish average. Many posts are part-time and the number of people with multiple jobs is the highest in the country. Even then, they can't always make ends meet.
A lot of people are in work but are also having to claim benefits because of the low wages that they're on. And it creates great problems for people in terms of poverty. We see a lot of people who are in work but who are experiencing high levels of debt. Over the last year we've dealt with 800 cases and looking at debt in the level of £12.5 million. You know, it's a lot of money, and that'll only be the tip of the iceberg in the region, the £12.5 million that we're dealing with.
Already, what we like to think of as character has been...
Textile mills like this used to underpin the Borders economy, but few remain. The manufacturing base has largely collapsed, and farming, forestry and tourism are not enough to keep aspiring youngsters.
We have as good schools down here as most of Scotland. We produce as many good children who are competent and qualified as anyone else. The difficulty we have is that the vast majority of them have to go out of the region to further their education or to find significantly quality gainful employment. And regrettably, we don't see many returning to the area.
But there are some positives. Dumfries and Galashiels now have university campuses to help stem the exodus of youth. And then there's the railway, which from September will see trains connect the central Borders with Edinburgh for the first time in half a century.
Since 1969, when the beaching cuts took place, the Scottish Borders has survived, but it could have done a whole lot better had the railway been in place. This train will transform the area. It will revitalise our high streets, it will bring new skill sets into the area in terms of jobs.
That's the hope, and already it is helping attract new businesses, like this deli and cafe.
And it's an unknown quantity. It could well suck business out of Galashiels as people are more able to get to Edinburgh and shop there. So I think until the railway is up and running, we need to see exactly what the outcomes of that will be. But hopefully it will be extremely good for Galashiels and it will bring tourism into the greater Borders area.
This was Scot country, and this Sir Walter's favourite view of it. Bonny Borders countryside, but politically now just maybe a changing landscape. Willie Johnston reporting Scotland, Scots View.
Well, from Scots View to the view from Scots House, I'm joined by Willie Johnston and also by Cameron Buttle, who covers the Borders for us. Willie, we talk about the south of Scotland, but it's quite distinct communities, really, isn't it?
It's a huge territory, more than 200 miles coast to coast, and there are certainly common issues, common problems right across that territory. Issues caused by the rural nature of the area, by the low-wage economy, by the lack of skilled jobs, by depopulation, also by the lack of transport and communications infrastructure. And that's partly why I think that there is no common identity. We don't look east to west, west to east, we look to the north. So Dumfries and Galloway would tend to look towards Ayr and Glasgow, the Scottish Borders to Edinburgh. And politically, there's no single political identity either. Witness the fact that in the last Parliament, the MPs from west to east were from Labour, Conservative and the Lib Dems.
Cameron, when we talk about the Borders area, what are the issues you think that will drive change here?
I think one of the big things here, what people are looking for is a Borders champion, if you like. Who's going to fight their corner down here? Who's going to fight for this corner of Scotland? In September, you've got the railway opening. It's going to be stopping a couple of miles from here. Who is going to make the most of the economic benefits that railway is going to bring? Who is going to be able to spread those benefits to places like Selkirk and Hawick and Kelso? Traditionally, this has always been a two-horse race, Conservatives and Lib Dems. This time round, very much the SNP right up there fighting in.
And Labour, of course, in there pitching as well. But William, interested in this point that Cameron is making there, that perhaps the old certainties, as they were, of south of Scotland politics, in as much as one can ever be certain, but I think perhaps those certainties are being challenged.
Very much so. I mean, we're entering a very different electoral landscape at this particular election. The traditional parties that have represented this area are definitely being challenged. The SNP, if the polls are correct, look like coming to be real challengers from third, even fourth position last time round.
And Cameron, just finally, I mean, the south of Scotland did not vote yes in the referendum, it's fair to say that. And yet, as Willie says there, the SNP still appear to be challengers along with the other parties, contenders at the very least, if not potential winners.
It was a big no vote here during the referendum. It was the second biggest no vote in the country. I think people are I've been meeting people here. They are talking about tactical voting, but I think there's also a lot of personalities involved here as well.
Thank you both very much indeed. Willie Johnson, Cameron Buttle, thanks very much for joining me here at Abbotsford, where, as I say, we've got the view from Scott's House, but the view of the south of Scotland politics, and hearing there the very distinctive nature and changing nature of politics here and perhaps across Scotland, and perhaps indeed across the whole of the UK. From Abbotsford, I'll hand you back to the studio, Sally.
Brian Taylor, thank you very much. I envy you being down there tonight. Lovely place. That is Reporting Scotland. I'll be back with the headlines at 8 and the late bulletin just after the 10 o'clock news. Until then, from everyone on the team right across the country, have a good evening.